The second conversation, I would put Post-it notes on my computer screen reminding me of things not to say. For example, how's it going? Okay? Or see you later. I mean, just stuff that you say all the time that when you say it to somebody who's going to be dead in 30 minutes, you think, oh my God, I cannot believe that I just asked this guy, how's it going?
David R. Dow is the Cullen Professor at the University of Houston Law Center and the Rorschach Visiting Professor of History at Rice University. He teaches and writes in the areas of contracts, constitutional law and theory, First Amendment and death penalty law. David also runs a death penalty clinic in which law students assist in the representation of inmates facing execution. Over the past 20 years, David and his team have represented more than 100 death row inmates at every stage of their state and federal appeals. He is the author of 6 books and scores of scholarly articles. His critically acclaimed memoir, The Autobiography of an Execution, was the winner of a 2010 Barnes & Noble Award for nonfiction, and his most recent book, Things I've Learned from Dying, was named by NPR as one of the best books of 2014. His TED Talk on the death penalty has been viewed more than 3 million times. In this episode, David shares some incredible stories with us, how he ended up working with prisoners on death row, some idiosyncrasies of the death row process, and why he needs to put Post-it notes on his screen in front of him so he doesn't say the wrong thing to someone who he has just told they are going to die. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, please do sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com. Now get ready for this fascinating episode, Waiting to Die.
I guess the first question for you, David, is how did you end up representing death row inmates? How did you manage to get there?
By accident, completely by accident. What happened was that about 25 years ago, I went and met a bunch of death row inmates because I was teaching a class at the law school that had a small connection to death penalty law. And so I just thought that I would understand the subject that I was teaching better if I went and learned it from the ground up. And at that time, inmates on death row in Texas, and for that matter, pretty much everywhere, didn't have a right to have a lawyer during what are known as their habeas corpus appeals, which is a type of legal appeal that is very complicated and arcane. It dates back to the 16th century England. So it's an old legal procedure. And inmates didn't have a right to a lawyer. And so somebody who I was with asked me if I would agree to represent one of these guys because he was scheduled to be executed in 2 weeks' time from the time that I met him, and he had no lawyer. And I said, I don't have any idea what I'm doing. I've never done death penalty work before. When I used to be a trial lawyer before I started teaching, I did commercial law. And the guy said to me, well, you might not know what you're doing, but at least you have access to a law library, which the prisoner didn't really have. I agreed that I would work on that case. I really thought that that would be the one and only case that I would work on. He had an execution date scheduled for 2 weeks. I thought that I'd be working on the case for 15 days. I figured there's no way that we're going to get past this execution date, and then we won't get past it, and I'll have done my best, and I'll go back to the other things that I do. But what happened was that we did, in fact, get past that execution date. I ended up keeping him alive for almost 7 more years, and I found the work to be extremely rewarding on 2 different dimensions. It's very challenging intellectually, and I'm drawn to intellectual challenges, but I also found it very rewarding emotionally. These guys on death row, as I learned, are generally, not 100%, but generally people who have really never gotten any type of break from society their entire lives. They're born into terribly dysfunctional families. The state doesn't really care at all about them. And I got to know them, and I got to know their families. Many of these people have sons, daughters. They, of course, all had moms and dads. A number of them are married or have significant others. And so I just got to know these people as human beings in a way that I hadn't before. One day I woke up and a quarter century had gone by, and I'd represented another 110, 115 guys after that first one. Here I am thinking it's about time for me to retire from this line of work. I have a number of young lawyers in my office, and I hire them. I would say that 100% of the young lawyers that I hire are people who they know in law school that they want to do criminal work, and probably they even know that they want to do death penalty work. And I was just completely unlike them. I came here by accident.
So how is it actually? Because I live in France, and
Yes.
we don't have, well, the death penalty has been abolished in the 80s. And how is it for you to be in contact with somebody who you know that can end up dead in, as you say, a couple of weeks or a couple of months or so some years? How is it for you?
Even more than a couple of months or a couple of weeks, what happens at the end of an appeal is that you know that you're at the end of the appeal. You know when you're at the end of the legal road. And so when you get to the end of the legal road, you tell your client, this is the end of the road, and you're going to be dead in a week, 3 days, 2 days. And many times the final appeal does not get turned down until the day of the execution. The executions now in Texas happen between 6 at night and midnight. When I first started, they happened between midnight and dawn the next day. So they were literally in the middle of the night. And now they're during happy hour, so that when you go to the prison to see your client who's being executed, the prison is in a small town that has a university in it. It's in Huntsville, Texas, and it's right across the street from Sam Houston State University. And you might come out of the prison at 6:30 or 6:45 after watching an execution, and you see college students playing Frisbee, and you see people coming out of the cafes and the bars on 12th Street, and it's just very surreal. And what often happens, and I would say probably 10% of my cases, and maybe even more than that, is that the final appeal doesn't get turned down until somewhere after 5 o'clock on the day of the execution. So that my client is in a holding cell about 8 steps away from the execution chamber, and I call him up on the phone and report that we just lost and you're going to be dead in 30 minutes. And so it's a very strange type of conversation. When I first started to have this experience, when I made my very first, well, no, that's not right. The first phone call that I made, I butchered it terribly. And so as a result, and you'll see what I'm talking about in just a second, as a result, the second conversation, I would put Post-it notes on my computer screen reminding me of things not to say. For example, how's it going? Okay. Or see you later. I mean, just stuff that you say all the time, that when you say it to somebody who's going to be dead in 30 minutes, you think, oh my God, I cannot believe that I just asked this guy, how's it going? And so the very first time that I called somebody, I just stepped all over myself, and you can't fix it. I mean, you really can't fix it. And so for the next few conversations, I would write things not to say on a Post-it note, and I would stare at my computer screen while I was talking to my client just to make sure that I didn't say any of those completely boneheaded things. But I'll tell you something remarkable, and I know we don't want to talk about politics, so let's just talk about humanity. I'll tell you something remarkable. Maybe the second or the third guy who I called to tell him he was going to be dead in 30 minutes. You know what he said to me? He said, "Thank you. Thank you." Who says thank you to a lawyer who's calling to say, I'm sorry to tell you we just lost. The Supreme Court just turned us down. You'll be dead in a few minutes. And I didn't know how to respond. And I thought, this is strange. What kind of automatic speaking pattern was this guy locked into that he said thank you as opposed to it's been nice knowing you or something like that. Then the next person I called said thank you. And the next person that I called said thank you. And eventually, so many people said thank you that I thought to myself, I really need to spend a little bit of time thinking about why these people are saying thank you. to me because I'm telling them that I've just lost. I think that the answer to that is that these are, as I say, almost without exception. There are some exceptions, but almost without exception, these are people that nobody has ever done anything for before. Parents didn't care about them. Their teachers didn't care about them. Their previous lawyers didn't care about them. There wasn't any human being that cared about them. There wasn't any social institution that cared about them. And then my team and I, we cared about them and we tried to save their lives. And so it occurred to me that what they're saying thank you for is not because we succeeded. They're saying thank you because they have not previously had the experience of somebody trying so hard to accomplish something good on their behalf. I wrote a book 8 years ago called Autobiography of an Execution, which is my first memoir about being a death penalty lawyer. And it was translated into France. Let's see, I don't have the French copy right above me or else I'd grab it and hold it up. But it was translated into France. And so I went to France and did a book tour and did some media stuff and did some radio stuff there. And one of the highlights of the trip for me was that I had lunch in the Senate cafeteria with Robert Badinter, who was the Minister of Justice during President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing. Yes, and was basically responsible for the abolition of the death penalty in France. And I was there shortly before a death penalty museum was set to open. It was basically a museum to the history of the death penalty in France that Minister Badinter had been responsible for. And so after we had lunch, I got in a car with him and he took me and we had a private tour of this museum the day before it officially opened. And the guillotine is in the museum. And he told me that the curators of the exhibition had not wanted to put the guillotine there because it's an awesome killing device. And he had said, if the guillotine is not here, we're not going to have the exhibition. That's central to it because it's just something that conveys the power of what an execution is in the way that really nothing else can. But it was just a real privilege that I had to tour that museum with him and to have lunch with the person who was responsible for accomplishing something in France that, of course, had already happened in the rest of Western Europe. But here we are, a generation later, and we're still killing people over here in the U.S. Yeah, it takes us a while to learn.
A couple of questions on what you said there, David. Just one, I'm just intrigued. What's the reasoning behind the fact that the executions happen in the evening or in the middle of the night? What's the rationale behind that?
I don't know what the rationale for the middle of the night was. I think I know the rationale for why they moved it. When they had them in the middle of the night, it was inconvenient for the prison officials because there's obviously the prison is operating 24 hours a day. There's a third shift of guards that gets to work at midnight and works until 8 in the morning. But the higher ups in the prison, by higher ups I mean to include the warden, working at the prison is a 9 to 5 job for them. And if you're the warden of what's called the Walls Unit, which is where they execute people in Texas, you don't really want to have to go back to work after you go home and have dinner with your family to preside over an execution. So my sense is that the reason that they moved the executions from midnight until 6 was just because it's more convenient for prison officials. I don't know why they started having them at midnight, maybe so that they could hide them in the middle of the night. It's harder nobody's watching the news at 1 in the morning. So when the execution happens, the whole rest of the state is asleep, and maybe you read about it the next day in the newspaper, but there's not a breaking news story that so-and-so was just put to death in the execution chamber in Huntsville. I suspect that's why they started doing them after midnight, but I'm reasonably confident that they moved them earlier just for the convenience of the people who have to carry out the execution. In the old days, now what's called a death warrant, which is the legal document that the judge signs that goes to the prison officials telling them to carry out the execution. The death warrant says that the person should be put to death after 6 p.m. on a certain date. So let's just say July the 1st. So after 6 p.m. on July the 1st. And so that means between 6 p.m. and midnight, because of course at 1 second past midnight, it's now July the 2nd. So death warrant only has one date in it, but it also has a time in it. And so that creates that roughly 6 hour, well, not roughly, that 6 hour window. In the old days, when the executions were at midnight, the execution said that the execution should occur after midnight on a certain date before dawn. Okay, so dawn is not like there's not a clock that has an hour that is dawn, right? I mean, dawn is different depending on what time of year it is, and there's some imprecision in it. And I was working on a case. Oh my gosh, this had to have been 20 years ago. It was back when the executions were between midnight and dawn, and we were literally litigating the case at the Supreme Court all night. So it got to be 1 a.m, 2 a.m, 3 a.m, and the Supreme Court had still not decided the case. And Texas has a practice of not actually going forward with the execution if there's still something pending in the Supreme Court. They could if they wanted to, because there's not anything legally that is preventing them. The fact that the Supreme Court is considering something doesn't prevent the state from carrying out the execution unless the Supreme Court says, don't go forward with this execution until we tell you that you're permitted to. But absent that, the state could carry out the execution if it wants to, even though the Supreme Court hasn't responded yet. But by practice, the state doesn't. And so it was 3 a.m, 4 a.m, 5 a.m. And finally, it started to get light over in East Texas. You know, the sun came up above the horizon, and the Attorney General said, I don't think we can do this anymore because I'm pretty sure that dawn has broken here in Huntsville, Texas. And so they had to take the guy out of the execution chamber and back to death row. And then eventually the case was decided and he got executed a few months later. But it was a quaint type of legal document that said to kill somebody before sunup is what it said. You know, after midnight, before sunup on a particular day.
We all know that we are all mortal. You know, we know that one day we will die, you know, but we don't know the date. And I think we all have this question, you know, that the main difference here with these deaf inmates is they know, they have kind of a period or even a date sometimes that this is it. How do you live with that? You know, you've been in contact with these inmates. How do they digest this news? They know that, okay, your expiration date is this date, this hour.
So I'll turn that around on you, because I ask this question all the time. I say to people, you're exact. We all know we're going to die. Most of us do not know when we're going to die. But if you could know that, would you want to? So if you had a choice between knowing that 6 months from today, I'm going to have a lethal injection of some drug and it's going to kill me, or it could be 6 months from today, I'm going to have a heart attack and die. 6 months from today, somebody's going to shoot me and kill me. It doesn't really matter how, right? You just know that 6 months from, or the alternative is that sometime between now and the next 2 years, you're walking across the street and you get flattened by a truck. What would you rather?
Keith, go on. I don't have the answer.
You asked the question. You can go first.
It's hard, right? It's hard, right?
It is difficult.
It's hard because on the one hand, there's just something that's very creepy about circling a date on your calendar and then putting an X on every day that goes by and realizing that when you get to that circle date, you're going to be, there's just something that's creepy about that. There are people who, they have a genetic test to know that if they are disposed towards some disease, but they don't want to know the results of the test, right? And I completely understand that. It's creepy to think you're tearing off the pages of the calendar, and when you get to one page left, that's it, you're dead. On the other hand, what happens is that you tie up all the loose ends. Mm-hmm. You say things to people that you need to say, that you wanted to say, that maybe you haven't said. You tell people in your life who mean a lot to you and who you love that they mean a lot to you and you love them, and maybe you've never told them before. And people who are coming to talk to you, they know that it's the last chance to talk to you. So it just makes it a very sort of intense type of personal dynamic. I mean, I will tell you that I'd rather get flattened by a truck walking across the street. That, you know, I would rather go that way. But I think that when somebody says to me, God, not me, I want to know so that I can tie up all the loose ends. There's part of me that understands that. When I go see I had a client get executed in October. He was a client who I was particularly close to. the last conversation that I had with him was about the last conversation that he had had with his father. He had already had the going away, I love you, Dad, conversation with his father. I was struck by how meaningful that was to him, by how meaningful it was that he had had the opportunity to have that conversation and say things that most people don't get a chance to say to their loved ones. So I myself would rather get hit by the truck, but I do see the other side of that analysis.
It's an interesting one because it's part of like what we're trying to do with this podcast is to use death as a, if we look at it more closely and the things it gives, as you said, to actually know feels a bit creepy, but that doesn't stop us living as if we know. So we don't have to miss out on those meaningful things. So it's almost it's that, because, and I know exactly what you're saying. It's just the idea of knowing when the date is and ticking it off, although it has very practical uses.
Yes.
And it would just feel, it'd be like a cloud, even though even though again logically we know that's coming one day anyway. It's just because we know, that doesn't make any difference, but it does on some level. Its brains can't seem to get around it.
I think that you're right, except that what I would say about that is that when you're in prison, it doesn't affect you quite the same way.
Yeah.
If somebody walks into your house right now and says that in 90 days you're going to be dead, you're going to think, oh my God, I don't think I can leave my house. It's like, it'd be sort of paralyzing, right? But if you've already been living in a tiny little cell for 6, 7, 8 years, sometimes longer, I don't think that it turns your world upside down in quite the same way.
That's what I was going to ask that as well. It's from the people, obviously they get sentenced, they go through the system, they end up on death row. And as you said, some of them can be there for long periods of time. Have you noticed any patterns in changes in people as they get closer in terms of how they behave or what they consider or what they value? Have you seen any changes there?
That's a very interesting question. And the answer is that yes, they change, but they don't change because of the specter of death. A lot of people, I think, have the misconception that this change comes over these guys as soon as they see the Grim Reaper at the end of the hallway waiting for them. In fact, that's not really how it happens at all. What generally happens is that these guys who have just been, they've just been boneheads for their whole lives. They were running in gangs, and they weren't taking education seriously, and they weren't taking the prospect of careers seriously. What happens is that they get into prison. It usually happens actually while they're in jail, while they're still waiting to go to trial. And they just grow up really, really fast. They have an appreciation for things that they've never appreciated before. So what I really see in most of my clients is maturity. And coming with maturity is also remorse. People say, oh, the only reason that they're remorseful is because they're going to get executed. I say, no. They're remorseful from almost the day they arrive, when being executed is just still way, way, way off down the road. It's so far down the road that it's not even real yet. And they're remorseful because they have an opportunity. They cannot escape being forced to think about what they've done. If you think about all of the sorts of escapist activity that we're able to engage in, I can go watch a movie on Netflix, or I can just sit down and listen to some music or pick up a novel and just get away from my problems. But if you're on death row in Texas, you don't have a television. You're in a 64 square foot, I don't know what that is in meters, about 13 square meters cell for 23 hours a day. And you don't have internet or anything like that. You have a radio, but you're so far out in the country, you get about 3 stations. You get Christian talk radio and you get some country music, And so you're literally all by yourself with just your thoughts. And all that you have to do all day long is just think about your life and things that you could have done better and people that you've hurt and mistakes that you've made. And if you're not forced to confront those things, you probably won't. But if you are forced to confront them as a human being, you think, God, I really wish that I had made some different choices. So I see my clients grow up. That's what I really see happen to them.
Maybe we all need some mandatory thinking time.
It's funny because I mean, my day job is I'm a university professor, right? What do university professors get paid to do? They get paid to sit around and think about things. But you're thinking about academic things as opposed to your own life. I'm not sitting around thinking to myself, God, I really wish that I hadn't snapped at my kid this morning. Or I really wish that I had been more supportive of my wife when she was dealing with some crisis last week. I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking about what should be the rule for hate speech on college campuses. So it's a different type of thought that you spend your day immersed in, unless you're in prison, where you invariably are thinking about the mistakes you've made and the people that you've hurt, because that's why you're in prison, because of the mistakes you've made and the people that you've hurt. I've noticed from really my very first days representing these guys that they are more introspective and thoughtful and remorseful than I would have thought, and not because they're scared. As a matter of fact, a lot of them aren't scared. A lot of them, they're really ready to be executed. They don't tell me to pull the plug on their appeals, mostly because I tell them that if they do that, I'm going to have to contest that, and that's going to actually prolong the process, because you can tell your lawyer to terminate the appeals, but you have to be mentally competent in order to make that decision. And so I, as a lawyer, have an obligation to make sure that my client, if he tells me to stop the appeals, is mentally competent and not making that decision because of some coercion or pressure. So I tell them, you can instruct me to drop your appeals if you want to, but I'm just telling you, I tell my clients that I'm going to have a judge determine whether you're competent to make that decision, and maybe the judge will say yes, and maybe the judge will say no. But if your goal is to hurry up and get executed, you're better off just letting me do my job here, because I'm probably going to lose anyway, because we usually lose in these cases. So they're not scared to die, because the alternative is what I just described. It's living in a horrible environment, and you don't have any human contact at all. In the old days, when I first started doing this before 2000, death row inmates had human contact. They had cellmates, and they had work privileges, and so they had group exercise and things like that. And so for the gay guys, there was an opportunity to have sexual intimacy. But everything is gone now. They spend all of their time alone. They don't have group anything. So that from the time that they arrive on death row until the time they get executed, the only human beings who touch them are prison officials, guards who have their hands on them when they move them from point A to point B, guards who tie them down to the gurney when they get executed, guards who extract them from their cells if they require a forcible extraction. But they don't get to hug their kids or their spouses. They don't get to put their arms around their buddies on death row and tell them a nasty joke or something like that. No, it's a completely inhuman, and I mean that just in a literal sense. I don't mean that it's cruel in the way that Saddam Hussein used to torture people. I just mean that human beings touch each other. You know, it signals intimacy. It's a form of communication, and for these guys, they are completely deprived of that. I had a client who was executed. Oh my gosh, it was a long time ago, 15 or 20 years ago, and he wasn't from Texas. He was from somewhere in the Midwest, and so all of his family was still in the Midwest, and most of his family actually died while he was in prison, but his wife didn't, and they stayed together, and she would come down to Texas once every 2 or 3 months to visit him. And when he was finally executed, she wanted to have a funeral service at the little tiny church chapel in Huntsville, Texas. And I said, why? There's not going to be anybody there. There's going to be the people from the coroner's office who bring in the coffin with the body in it. The coroners recover the body after the execution and take it to the funeral home and embalm it or whatever they do, and then put it in a coffin, and it was going to be an open coffin. I said, why on earth you want to have a funeral service at this church in a city where you don't know anybody and you'll be the only person sitting there. And she said, because he's been on death row 13 years. In those 13 years, I haven't been able to touch him. And I want to touch him before I bury him. And so she wanted to have this service with an open casket so that she could reach into the casket and hug her husband and touch him one last time before she put him in the ground. And I was just so moved by that.
You've been doing that for 25 years, right? And you've been in contact with death and people who you get to know them and then they die like this.
Yeah.
How did it change you, maybe? How did you evolve or mature, actually?
Wow, what an impossible question to answer. I've had maybe 3 or 4 lawyers who I've hired, and they come to work with me, and after the first execution, they quit. And they're great lawyers, and they're completely committed to the work. But they realize after their first client gets executed that they can't do this anymore. They just can't get out of bed the next day and go to the office. What I would say is that for the first 2 or 3 or maybe 4 clients I had who got executed, I had a terribly difficult time getting out of bed the next day. I felt like I had failed my client, but I also felt like I had failed my client's family, that there was somebody who was loved and who loved other people, and because I hadn't been able to think of some better legal argument, I let all those people down. We have a protocol in my office, which is that after every execution, we reverse engineer every decision that we make. A legal appeal looks a little bit like a complicated flow chart where there's just a lot of diverging nodes. But the thing is that once you go down one of those nodes, they're all one-way ratchets. You can't go back. And so you end up with somewhere. And so what we do at the end of a case when we've lost a client is we pull out that decision tree and we go back and we think about whether it would have made a difference if we had gone down some other node. The thing about conducting that exercise is that we have to conduct it because we have a lot of other clients. It's a little bit like figuring out why the airplane crashed. You can't save the airplane that's in the ground, but you can maybe save the next airplane. So we have to do it. But at the same time, you always identify different paths you could have gone down that might have turned out better. And they couldn't have turned out worse because you lost. So you're conducting this exercise, and the best possible conclusion is that we would have lost anyway. But the other possible conclusion is, but we might have won. It can be a very dispiriting type of post-mortem exercise, right? But what I tell my team at the end of it, when we get to the last step of the analysis and have cataloged all of the mistakes that we made, I tell my team, I say, but our client made the first one. And if our client hadn't committed the murder, then we wouldn't even be sitting here having this conversation about what we could have done to have saved him. That's true. It is, in fact, true, at least in cases where I don't think my client is innocent. And we didn't talk about that, but there have been a few. But most of them are not. Most of them unquestionably committed the murder. And so I say we might have made the last mistake, but our mistake wouldn't have mattered if our client had not put us into this decision tree of having to make these decisions in the first place. And so the answer, I think, to that really difficult question is, that's how I get out of bed. I think to myself, I made a lot of mistakes, but I tried my best. It was somebody else who set this whole process in motion. And so the best that I could hope for going into the system was to try to stop the gears from grinding. Now, I will tell you that that doesn't help me at all in cases where I think my client might be innocent. In cases where my client might be innocent, I don't get to say, hey, he made the first mistake, because no, I don't think he did make the mistake. I think the system made the first mistake. So, but that's generally what I do. And I also think that it's just entirely a matter of what is your personality? Some people are more resilient, and other people, they shouldn't be death penalty lawyers. The great novelist John Irving has a line where he says, the world is comic to those who think, but tragic to those who feel. So that if you're really a feeling person, then the tragedy is going to flatten you, and you're not going to be able to get past feeling the tragedy. Whereas if you're not primarily a feeling person, you step back and you think, this is one screwed up system that we have here. And if it weren't for the fact that we were killing people at the end of the day, it would in fact be humorous. It's so screwed up.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at deathhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.